Hi guys, today we'll continue on the Unit 2 of LSP510/03 Qualitative Research Design and Data Analysis. Unit 2 will be on qualitative sampling method. Now, some of you might sound, this is funny, like why am I learning about sampling anymore? I have learned enough about this during my undergraduate years, isn't it? So let's just talk briefly about what is sampling first. I imagine for both qualitative and quantitative methods, the definition of sampling, of course, would be similar. The idea is to select representative cases from a typically substantially larger population for research. So again, the idea is to get a smaller group, yeah, from the whole population in order to actually run your research. Typically, because it would be too costly or just impossible to actually get the whole population in. That's where the scientific method is important, isn't it? You can actually run a research on a smaller sample, smaller group. Then through statistical method or empirical design, you are able to generate the result that you get on a larger population. Yeah. So yeah, you might want to try this on like from A and B, which one is more the representative sample. As we'll discuss later on, this is one of the reason why you are learning about qualitative data sampling, given that the focus of sampling in qualitative and quantitative research are a bit different. Yeah. Now you have to be aware of, it doesn't matter how well you design your experiment, how perfect the execution is, it's really highly unlikely, if it's not impossible, that any sample will be a perfect representation of the population. Yeah? So there will be some differences or imperfection, yeah, in the sampling or for the sample to represent the population itself. Yeah, and again, that's the reason why statistics is important. They are manner or methods that you can use in statistical analysis in order to try to minimize the effect of that imperfection or that inconsistency between the sample and population. Now, reason for sampling, again, for both quantitative and quantitative research would be the same, is to obtain a statistically representative sample that is smaller in size. But for quantitative research particularly, the focus is to gain a sample that's mathematically identical. So ideally lah. So in terms of all the variables that you are interested in and etc., the sample should be similar, if not identical, to the population itself. But again, as mentioned, that is virtually impossible. Yeah. And in quantitative research, we typically use probability sampling methods. Again, this is something that we will cover more in 511. Yeah, quantitative research method and design analysis. Okay, and probability sampling method means that there's certain algorithm that you can use or probability formula that you can use in order to select your participant. Example would be like random sampling, if we do have the ability or access to all data, and we can randomly choose people that we want to recruit. Okay, it's much like picking names randomly in a phone book and then call them. Okay, if you still remember what is a phone book, that is. Okay, now, so example, let's say the purpose of the research is to study the category of talent of secondary school students in Penang. Okay, so it's like what type of talent do they have? Let it be music, let it be verbal, public speaking, mathematics, and etc. So let's say that in Penang, according to Google, there's about 107,000 of secondary student record from last year lah. Okay, now if you want to actually recruit all of them and then run a multiple tests on them, because remember you are trying to get like what talent do they have, meaning that you will need to try all possible tests on them. That would be a nightmare. So you take a sample of 107 students from the 107,000, that will reduce cost by 1,000 times. And cost not only in terms of money, can be in time as well as other resources, like whether the researcher can live long enough in order for this to finish. Okay, and supposedly if you've done your design well and your sampling execution is really careful, then results should be generatable to all Penang secondary students, but the cost is reduced by about 1,000 times. Yeah, so that is for quantitative research. In most cases it's impossible to do it on the whole population. In most cases it's actually to save time and other resources lah. Yeah, but you need to make sure that the result is applicable or is generalizable to the wider population. That's why always the argument about external validity, yeah, or generalizability in this case. Now, for qualitative research, the reason of sampling is a bit different. Again, the focus is no longer on the representativeness or the mathematical identity, yeah, or now is to identifying the relevant category with just a few cases, meaning that you want to get the information that you require, again, all the rich data that you mentioned in Unit 1, with just a few cases, so number is no longer a focus here. The focus now is to be able to actually generate information regarding the essential feature of a social world, yeah, through interaction, like through conversation, etc. Yeah, an example, like you want to know what actually happened in a social relationship or in a social scene. So example, if you go to a speed dating setting up, what will happen there, what are you thinking, what is your experience, all those things. The purpose is to generate a deeper understanding, or a rather complex social world. And remember, qualitative design is good, or qualitative research method is good in the fact that you are able to generate a wide range of information, not actually restricted to the question that you ask or the psychometric measure that you use. Yeah, so you will be able to gain the information that is most relevant to the participant of interest who actually experience the event or the uh, issues or phenomena of your interest. And because of this, the sampling method used tend to be non-probabilistic, so meaning that there's no formula algorithm. There are other things that you actually follow or you use as a guideline when you are recruiting a participant, which we will go through later on. There's 16 strategies in total that will actually talk about what you can use depending on your research questions to serve as a guide for your sampling frame. Now, sampling is always a challenge for both type of research, quantitative or qualitative. Like quantitative, the main challenge, of course, is to able to recruit enough number and you identify the correct population and sample, yeah, where the sampling is being done on. And in qualitative research, while it itself, the definition is confusing, sampling is also confusing in qualitative research. Yeah, the main reason being that most people, like I mentioned earlier on, when we talk about sampling, we will straight away go to quantitative research sampling. We do not consider that there's a special sampling strategies or method you can use for qualitative research. Well, there is. Now, why this is essential, and this picture actually illustrates, this is where President Truman, the past previous US president, actually make this as a joke or just mock the paper, Chicago Daily Paper, who seriously like conservative and don't really like Truman to be winning. So even before the result comes out, they already make a prediction that Dewey, which is another candidate at that time, would defeat Truman. But then it turns out that it's the other way around. Truman actually wins uh, with a minor advantage, so he actually won the presidency. So you can see that he's grinning and happy there. So it turns out that the paper have actually recruited people that are more conservative who really actually voted for Dewey, but then he did not actually take into account of middle group that actually turns to Truman's side rather than Dewey's side. So yeah, you can imagine how embarrassed it is that they actually need to recall the paper and everything. Now, there are some challenges in sampling for qualitative research, in particularly given the idea that they are different from quantitative and you can see later or learn later on that the focus is totally different, so there will be some challenges there. And most 1991 basically criticized that we should not be using random sampling in qualitative research, yeah, because random sampling again do not allow you to determine what is the key criteria when you are trying to select participants. If you let it be decided randomly, you might not be able to select the appropriate respondent for the research question that you're asking. So he's saying that we should be focusing on what makes a good informant. So your participant you want to recruit would actually fit these characteristics. One is the one that actually able to generate rich data. As in most cases, they are people who have been a participant or who have gone through or experienced the phenomena of your interest. Yeah, something that you are actually studying. So for example, if you are studying the experience of nurses, yeah, during the COVID-19 pandemic, okay, and which means that you should be recruiting nurses, right, who work during the pandemic time. You should not be recruiting nurses who only started working after that or who have already retired before the pandemic. or not nurses at all. Yeah, so those people would not be able to give you appropriate or not, let alone rich data. Yeah, you need to select people who can reflect well on his or her own experience. Meaning that they are able to actually recall well, and they will have much personal reflection on the matter rather than simply, oh yeah, I work on that day for how long, etc. It should be more in-depth experience. Yeah, like whether they feel tired, why they feel tired, do they feel like they lost hope at that time, etc. Like going back to the nurses in who are working during the COVID time example. Yeah, and it should be someone who are able to articulate well, because remember, for qualitative research, data are actually obtained through conversation. If the person is not able to converse well, then yeah, basically it will be a real challenge to try to get data from them lah. Imagine someone who are having an interview with you and doesn't, despite any questions or regardless of whatever question that you ask, they will only say yes, no, or that lor, like it's like that, then you can imagine that what can you actually write for your qualitative data. There's nothing. You would do want to get someone who are able to talk or like to talk in this case, in order to get rich data lah. Of course, as discussed in unit 3 later on, there will be some steering involved also. You don't want to let the person ramble on if the information is not actually meaningful. Okay, and lastly, they have to be willing to share. So someone could be an introvert who have really deep reflection on the data, and they are able to articulate well. Yeah, so they are able to speak well, write well. The English is almost perfect. But if they are not willing to share with you, in most cases, a stranger, yeah, then it will be all for nothing. That's the reason why, if you remember for Unit 1, one of the key features of qualitative research is that the researcher and the respondent tends to form a really close relationship, because without that, gaining a rich data would be really a challenge. Okay, so although the key focus is not on the sample size anymore or the representation of the sample, is more whether you get good informant or not. And in this case, they have to be relevant to the research topic or research question that you're asking lah. Yeah, now one of the major challenge of qualitative research sampling is the gatekeeper bias. Okay, this is a sampling bias caused by an external party who will call a gatekeeper in this case, having control over who can be recruited in the study. Okay, so what can be a gatekeeper? So think about this. For example, so researcher who wish to study the experience of caring for elderly patient. Okay, so let's say like during COVID time lah. Okay, so who would be the gatekeeper if you think about it? So first thing you want to think about is where would be the site of your recruit participant? Where would be the participant site? Yeah, experience of caring for elderly patients. Let it be elderly home, yeah, elder homes, or it could be the hospital. So let's say that you actually go to the hospital, yeah. Before you can decide that you want to talk to nurses or doctors, who do you need to talk to? It will be the management of the hospital, yeah, and of course whoever that you are talking to or have a conversation first. If the hospital management is okay with it, then they will assign someone to basically be a liaison with you or coordinating your effort lah. The coordinator himself would be in the management level. Okay, then he or she would be the gatekeeper, because they are the liaison, they are the representative of the company, or in this case the hospital, and they are supposedly having the power to decide who you can talk to or whether you can talk to or not. Okay, so they are the gatekeeper. They are your access to the participant. So outside of them, you will have no access. Okay, this could be really problematic, because again, the power of deciding who can participate is out of the hand of the researcher, and there's no way to take into account the potential bias of the gatekeeper. Again, you don't know them, he or she, even if they are the participant. You don't know how they are going to make their decision of whether they will allow you to talk to the participant or not, or how long you can talk to the participant. Yeah, so in this case, it could be a real challenge. Yeah, especially if the gatekeeper themselves is not really cooperative lah. Like they seriously don't like the idea. Particularly, they are against the idea that why should the employees actually take time away from their work to talk to you. Yeah, it's like it doesn't actually bring direct benefit to the company. Why would I want to do so? So that could actually present a challenge. Now, there are some general features of potential gatekeepers that qualitative researcher can bear in mind. Yeah? And these are the tendency or features that you can use lah, when you are actually engaging a gatekeeper, like how to actually keep them happy, etc. So firstly, they have a prevailing tendency to compare themselves to others' management style, because they tend to come from a lower level of the hierarchical organizational hierarchy, but they are still in the management level, like a lower level management, and who are aspire to actually climb the corporate ladder to become the CEO one day, hopefully. And that's the reason why they really like to compare themselves to other people's like management style and trying to establish that their management style is better. Okay, and they have an inclination to discover how they can contribute personally to the research, like how they can help you, for a lot of reasons. One, maybe to feel satisfied. Most cases, like they do want to credit somewhat, like if it's something that's really important, let's say that you are running a qualitative research on, again, experience of nurses caring for elderly patients during the pandemic, and your funding is actually from the Ministry of Health. Yeah, so it's like, oh, your paper will be published under the Ministry of Health and everything. So if you actually mention their name as a hospital management that actually helps with this research that inform policy making, etc., really care about patients, that would be essential, or something that's quite critical for them. So you can imagine why they want to actually find out how they can personally help you. These are the things that you can actually, unlike the word that can manipulate or use when you're trying to interact with the gatekeeper in order to get a more cooperation from them lah. Again, not exactly bribing. By mentioning their name, etc., if they are allowing it or they want to, is something that's accepted in qualitative research lah. Most cases, of course, you do want to keep the confidentiality, if possible. Like if you do mention their name, then likelihood that the hospital would actually get out. So like not sure whether that is actually something the hospital want or whether the funding agency want. And once the hospital name actually get out, then the chances are participant name will get out as well. So there are several things that you need to consider here lah. When, let's say, the gatekeeper actually make those kind of requests. So what do you actually do? So some common gatekeeper concern, again, something that you want to bear in mind of when you are actually interacting or trying to get access to the participant through the gatekeeper. Yeah, they always worry about resource constraints first at the first thing. Yeah, whether participation or letting you talk to the participant respondents would result in work interruption. Would it affect their time, the finance, yeah, like their lost productivity, or how do they actually schedule it, etc. This would be easiest that if you are able to actually get like the support from the higher level management to say that, oh, actually give him or her whatever they need, etc. Please cooperate well. Then yeah, the gatekeepers tend to be more cooperative in this case. Now, in cases where the topic itself involves something that's quite sensitive, yeah, they might be afraid that there will be potential leak of information that could lead to a loss of competitive advantage. Okay, so it's like when you actually talk about technology, imagine what's the most hottest topic now, like about AI development. And what is the experience of engineer working on AI, etc. You would imagine that they would be concerned if the someone, when they're talking and carelessly actually let out or actually spill on the company secret. Yeah, so this is some of the concern. They are would concern about the breach of employees' privacy, so they are really likely to ask you. Again, in this case, it has to be clearly stated in the interview protocol, how are you going to protect the employees' privacy and confidentiality. Yeah? And they are really afraid of being portrayed in a bad light lah. Again, one example, imagine the person who actually go into Trump White House to actually make a record and interview people. Trump thought that he's going to write a nice book on him as a child, and then turns out that he will write about all the really bad things, and yeah, a conversation, they put a really bad light onto him, the White House. Not that there's anything good that Trump has done or can be praised upon. Like everything that he did is basically a disaster in general lah. In general, but yeah, you can see how that could be problematic and why gatekeeper is concerned lah. Okay, so that would be the gatekeeper bias. And then there are ways to navigate around it depending on what type of gatekeeper that you're dealing with. But these are some of the characteristics that you can actually use as a guideline as to how to deal with them. So next type of bias is the sampling frame bias. First of all, sampling frame for qualitative research refers to the characteristics of potential participant and the site where you recruit the participant. Okay, not much different from quantitative research if you can remember. Okay, this could be the first ever challenge for qualitative researcher. Again, if you think about rich data is the focus of qualitative research, and the quality of your data depends on whether you are able to recruit good participant or good informant. Yeah, that's why in this case you must put quite a lot of effort into identifying what are potential site for research where you can recruit people and how you negotiate the access. Okay. Some obstacles for that's linked to sampling frame bias is the protocol for getting permission has to be really clearly stated out. Again, remember we talked about in unit 1, saying that you are running a qualitative research doesn't mean that you can simply wing it. There are still things that you need to concern about. There are things that you need to be carefully designed in order to make sure that the research is done well. Okay, and how you're going to negotiate with the person in charge. In this case, it will be the gatekeeper lah. So bear in mind, we already discussed how you can navigate the process there. If you do not do A and B well, it could result in potential delay. Again, most studies will have a particular timeline, yeah, like a limited time where they have to generate data based on the funding that they have lah. If they put too much time into A and B and still unable to access the participant, then it will result in delay. It could be disastrous for the researcher where they have run out of funding, they can no longer actually done it, the funding actually dry out, etc. And lastly, the most biggest concern is the rejection by the gatekeeper. People say no. In this case, then you need to go to an alternative site, yeah, or try to engage someone who is higher in authority lah. Always an issue because there is already delay here if that actually happens, yeah. So you try to avoid that as much as possible. And the other thing is that you do want to have multiple potential sites before you actually go and engage with anyone, just in case like it's a backup plan. One. Number two is, as we discussed in the recruitment later on, you could actually involve multiple sites rather than just one, depending on the resources and the nature of the question that you're asking. So what are some of the countermeasures that you can use in order to try to minimize these two types of bias? Number one is, you as a researcher, you want to prepare a simple proposal before you ask for permission to access. So you would show the person in charge, in this case the gatekeeper, the proposal written and clearly stated things that they are worried about lah. Like I said, the concern that they have just now, you want to address them clearly. Yeah, you tell them the research aim clearly, who are the target sample and population, so that makes it easier for them to select people for you, not give you a wrong person that you approach, then you need to repeat the process again. In the procedure section, you need to make it really clear what is the benefit and risk. In this case, you want to include the benefit to the company as well lah. If it's like a private entity lah, of course, in that case you want to make sure that it will make you worthwhile in your case and stuff. Okay. Now, before you do write the sample proposal, it's actually a good idea to have one or more informal meetings with the stakeholders. In this case, not necessarily just the gatekeeper. It could be anyone who's willing to come in, including the CEO, so that they can actually address their concern, know how likely is it that they will allow you access, yeah, everything, and then you can put it into the proposal. Okay. Particularly talk to a person in charge. The higher you go, the better. Yeah. You go for the key officials if you can, or the decision makers. Yeah. All those are stakeholders. And again, if you can do go as high as possible. So patience is a virtue here. Do not try to rush things. It could actually cause more delay. Again, imagine you send out email, you actually talk to the person in charge, the gatekeeper, you send a really nice and sincere email, then they do not reply you for 2 weeks. You are on the verge of thinking, should I rush them, should I give them another call, etc. Depending on the topic and the person that you're actually talking to. There are some people who are quick to temper, so like you try to call them and asking about this, or even send a gentle reminder through email, they might feel offended and they just say, oh, then this does not work lah, we will just reject you, don't ask anymore, etc. That could be an issue. Yeah. Okay. So if possible, if there are public informations that's accessible online where you can get the basic information, let's say if you are trying to interview doctors, yeah, of a hospital and they have a website, then likely that you're able to get some information there. So you can actually prepare those information first before you actually go and talk to the gatekeeper to make sure that the person that you recruit is or able to join the experiment is actually someone who is appropriate. Okay. Initial contact can be online. Now, of course, because of the pandemic, it will be a concern. Or it could just more convenient, to be honest. Like nowadays, if it's not for particular reason, who else want to have a physical meeting? So online meeting will be much more convenient. Okay, so in that case, it will make it less costly for the gatekeeper to actually wanting to cooperate you. Okay, now when it actually comes to actual conduct thing, the data collection, meaning the interview lah, observation stuff, then face to face has its own advantage and online has its own advantage, because although online conducting this online through the phone is more convenient, you do lose some element of a human interaction if you're not doing it face to face. So you do have to consider the pros and cons, but we'll discuss that further in Unit 3 and 4. Okay. If possible, do utilize your own network, professional or personal lah. So you try to get a letter of support for someone who have some all over the decision making. Let it be the CEO's wife, daughter lah, whatever lah. Okay, or their brother lah. Yeah, I know it sounds nepotism right now. If you know the CEO directly, so great ahead. Or in some cases that I know of, they will get the support letter from, let's say, the deputy chief minister lah, yeah, as in the Penang one, etc. Okay, and if getting through a gatekeeper is not something that is preferred, like you already know that they are not going to participate, to support you and stuff, you can advertise for recruitment through various online platforms. There might be people who are willingly volunteer their time, especially if you are talking about things that could be linked to social injustice, and people really want to tell another person so that they can publish the data and make known to everyone else. Much I imagine the issues that we are facing with our doctors now, the doctors in the public hospital system. Okay, so it is quite a mess. Imagine that you are able to get hold of someone like their union member or union head and want to talk about this. They are more, I imagine, more than happy to actually talk to you about it. Okay, so that is the bias and the countermeasures. So next, let's actually go through some sampling strategies for qualitative research. As mentioned just now, random sampling is out of the question. It's definitely not suitable. You are unable to actually control well who, whether you can get the good information or not, since that you leave it to be like random. Yeah, okay. So that's why sampling in qualitative research actually demand more caution and care. You actually remember all the criteria requires in order for someone to be a good informant. Okay, so this is particularly an issue when there is a lack of resources, time or funding, etc., which is general a challenge for all researchers nowadays. That's why you do want to bear this in mind. Yeah, and even there is a qualitative research, it's important for the researcher to be flexible. They should be able to work well in a relatively dynamic, meaning that things are always changing. So imagine a gatekeeper one day say that it's fine, I'm really happy to help, then the other day he said no. Probably someone say something, or yeah, they have a really bad day at home and etc. So you must be able to work around it or adjust to it. Or when something is ambiguous, again, remember, qualitative research is supposed to be flexible. So there are a lot of cases where it's quite ambiguous, or you allow yourself to be ambiguous so that you can discover whatever that's emerged out of the research process. Yeah. Now, looking at the sampling, there are two main types of sampling for qualitative research. The first one is a theoretical sampling. This is a process where researchers will collect, code, and analyze the data initially first. Then only they decide what to actually collect next, meaning that they will keep it really general at first. Then from the data that they collected, they will look for something called an emergent pattern. Yeah, things that actually come out, like themes or interesting stuff that actually come out from the initial data. Then they decide on that basis, who to recruit next and what question we'll be asking. Okay, so example would be where you want to develop a new theory. For example, like how students deal with ChatGPT nowadays. It's totally new. ChatGPT is quite new. Okay, so there's no questions, there was no study about it yet previously, and you don't know what they are going to test. So in this case, you can actually talk to students or the developer, and through the data or the interview data, etc., you can see what would be a good question, research question to ask for future studies. Yeah. So that's why all the collection, coding, and analyzing is actually done simultaneously, given that you are looking for something general and you try to decide what is the next move, yeah, when you already get the emergent data. So participants are recruited as the need arises, a type of participant, number of participants, yeah. So it determined solely by whatever theories has emerged from the data, initial data itself. So examine the phenomenon where it's found to exist. So go with the flow basically in this case. So in general, there are two phases. You have the inductive phase. This is where you collect general information and you see what theory actually emerged from it. Then you go to the deductive phase where you recruit a more specific sample. Yeah, again, purposeful selection. Yeah, you purposeful selecting it based on a certain criteria in order to further develop or verify the emerging theory. You can see later on for the other type of sampling, there's something that's quite similar to this. So this is theoretical sampling. Okay, and the second type of sampling is called purposeful sampling. So you have to differentiate this from like convenient sampling and etc. Convenient sampling is just a type of purposeful sampling. So purposeful sampling, or called purposive sampling, is the process of identifying and recruiting participants who possess in-depth and personal experience regarding the target phenomena or issues that you are studying at the time. So those who have in-depth and personal experience are, again, basically the good informant that we talked about previously. It's called purposeful or purposive because you are targeting a particular type of participant there. Might sound biased, but that's the idea lah. In quantitative research, this will be biased, but in qualitative research, it will become purposeful, because you are trying to make sure or guarantee the quality of the data by doing it, by getting the good informant or participant who will generate enough information. Okay. So this might actually require several visits to the potential site. The idea is that you might not know who would be a good informant. Again, think about the example just now where you want to gain information regarding experience of nurses when they are caring for elderly during the COVID-19 time. You might actually need to go to hospital, talk to several of the nurses first, and gauge who would be a good informant in this case. Who are more willing to share, who actually have a deep reflections or experience regarding the issue at hand that you are actually studying. Like imagine someone who actually got sick and did not actually work much during the COVID time, then you probably would not be a good informant for your research question. Yeah. So some strategies of purposeful sampling, according to patent 2002. So first one is extreme or deviate case sampling. This is where you select people who are the extreme cases. This tends to be applied when the issues or the phenomena that you're actually looking at is quite rare. For example, let's say you are looking at experience of victims who are the victim of incest, where they are being, let's say, sexually abused or sexually molested by their own mom or father. In that case, they are quite rare, and the cases that you'll be selected for would be the extreme cases. Yeah. So they are the one who will be able to provide information regarding your particular topic that they are actually studying. If the case or the topic itself is not really something that's extreme, as mentioned just now, then you could be using intensity sampling. This is where instead of looking for the extreme cases, you look for the exemplary representation. Someone who would be the most representative of the particular case that you are actually looking at. Again, you are not looking for extreme, you are looking for whether they represent it. So for example, if you are talking about recruiting nurses just now, yeah, who actually work with elderly patients, etc., then you want to look for someone who have worked the longest with elderly patients, yeah, and particularly who spend a lot of time with the patients during the COVID-19 time, have worked in various setting, let it be the really severe cases, let it be the more modest cases, they all have actually done it. In that case, they would be the best representative lah, of the issues that you're actually looking at. So one of the example in Kashkalani is where they are actually looking at determining factors underlying number of clinical faculty members of medical school in Iran. So it's like how many faculty members actually the school hire in Iran, and there are several factors that they are looking at lah. So in this case, most representative cases they recruit for is the HOD lah, of the medical school, or the principal, who actually make the decision regarding the hiring lah. Okay, so those are the most representative one. The third strategy would be maximum variation sampling. So maximum variation, also called heterogeneity. This is where you want to get the sample that is most wider range. Yeah, so we're looking at the example here. Yeah, what can you see is different between the participants? You can gender, you can see age, you can see ethnicity. Yeah, so that's the idea. You want to get a sample that is most heterogeneous, where it's as different as possible, in order to counter the threat to validity. Again, the idea is that if your sample is too similar to each other, then you should not be able to generalize your data to other populations. Yeah, in that case, you want to get one that is really most different from each other, so that you can say, oh, because I included African American, then the data that I get should be able to apply to African American. If I include Asian, then it should be applied to Asian as well. Yeah, that's the idea to heterogeneity. But you have to be careful. While this sounds nice, it could lead into the fact that your participant is not specific enough. So again, it only applies if the specificity here, like say ethnicity, is not really an issue. So if you are asking about experience of African American dealing with, let's say, police in America, then recruiting with Caucasian or European American would be pointless, isn't it? So again, everything depends on the research question that you're asking. Yeah? So in opposition to that, then you can actually have a homogeneous sample. This is where instead of looking at a maximally different group, you actually want a group that's really specific and really similar to each other. This is particularly relevant if the topic itself is like on the particular group lah. Like I mentioned just now, if you are studying like experience of African American, yeah, being victimized by police and etc., then you would look for people who are African American who already have negative experience with the police previously. Okay. The fifth strategy is called typical case sampling. So typical case sampling means that you are looking for a typical case. And what defines a typical case is that you must have a list of criteria that actually define what is a critical case. Now, for this particular one, reaching a consensus will be a challenge, even within the researcher of the same group or between researcher. Like what is the typical case? Yeah, there are something that could be quite confusing or really hard to pinpoint. If you are talking about like a victim of a crime, then yes, they might be quite straightforward. Yeah, you can just say that it has to be a victim of domestic violence within 2 years, etc. Okay, even saying so is there are criteria that are really hard to pinpoint, like how severe does it need to be? Is simply verbal abuse or suffice, or it has to be physical abuse, where it has to be beating lah, or the victim has to be hospitalized. Yeah, all those things have to be clear when you are looking for a typical case. And again, you can imagine how this could be quite conflicting between participant, or sorry, between the researcher when they are trying to come up with a conclusion of what is the criteria. Okay. Now, way to actually get around this is that you want to consult key informant, like participants who actually know the topic quite well, in order to ask them like what would be a typical case in this case. Or it could be people who actually help or interact with the participant on a daily basis. So for example, again, if you are talking about abuse victim, then you could be asking like social workers. You can be asking about nurses who actually work the case. So those will be able to give you a better idea like what would be the typical case in this case, or what criteria should you be using. Okay, or you can actually research secondary data if there's a record of it. Again, like for domestic victim of domestic abuse, you can actually look at on average or median, what is the length of the abuse, how long does it have to go for before they actually report it, or someone actually report it. Yeah, typically what type of ordeal do they went through, what should you actually be focusing on. Those will give you a better idea of what is a typical case for you lah. Number six is called stratified purposeful sampling. Like this is something quite similar to stratified sampling, but still remain the purposeful lah. This is what we call like samples within samples. Yeah, so you have a case sampling in a nested manner. So what does it mean? You do recruit multiple sample of typical case, but they differ on some predetermined variables. Okay, so you don't focus on variation anymore, but you are not as much as the maximum variation one, but the idea is that you want to collect the sample first, then within the sample you want to be able to differentiate them. Okay, so for example, you are looking at same example, the victim of domestic abuse, yeah, then you can recruit all of them, then you can maybe separate them by age and separate them by ethnicity. So those are the idea of sample within sample. Then you conduct data collection based on the differences them. Now, all of them are victim of domestic abuse, but some of them might be younger, older, some of them might be Malay, Chinese. Yes, in this case, you are able to differentiate the experience and hopefully able to gain some insight into how these variables or factors influence their experience. Next one is critical case sampling. So critical case, in opposition to typical case, is the case that are particularly essential. Okay, similar to typical case, this require a really clear set of criteria. What do you mean by critical? So critical in this case would be the participant who will be able to yield the richest and most relevant data. Again, you can see how this is really similar to the extreme case, but for critical case, the phenomenon that you are looking at does not have to be extreme in nature. So it could be something that actually happened in daily life, or not something like crime, or not something that people frown upon. Yeah, this is more the idea is that you do have a lack of resources, so you cannot recruit as many people you can. In that case, you want to focus on several cases that really will give you the good quality data, enough data. Okay, but the concern, of course, if you do this, then generalization tend to be quite low. Again, you are recruiting really small number, and you're really looking at really specific cases. It allows you to have in-depth analysis, but then generalization might be low. So if you are using critical case, then you have to be more careful with your design. So again, making sure everything goes well, you are actually able to get enough data, and you are able to analyze the data quite well. So in this case, you will try to use data collections that would generate most data, perhaps combinations of different methods. Number eight is the snowball or chain sampling. Most of you who actually run the experiment later on would tend to use somewhat this lah. So snowball is when people actually introduce you to another person. So it's like they would help you to spread the news. Yeah. The good thing is that sample size will expand exponentially if you do so, according to this picture here lah. So like you must have a pyramid scheme lah. One researcher get 2 participants, and each participant get them 3 participants more. Okay, it will require minimal effort from the researcher. That's why it's one of the most popular qualitative sampling approach. Now, for this to work well, of course, the initial participant will need to know what type of participant respondent that the researcher is actually looking for, and they must be accurate in that case. Then of course, if it's wrong, then you just thank the person for their interest and everything, and don't include them in the process itself. So this is actually a good idea for qualitative research. Again, there are chances that the participant would know best who would be a good potential respondent for the next round. Yeah. Then you have the criterion sampling. This is where all cases will have to fit some predetermined significant criterion. Again, you actually fit the criterion first, then you actually look for the participant who actually fit it. This sounds really similar to quantitative research, sampling, but this focus mainly on procedure. So criterion sampling is typically used when you are gaining information in order to review like the potential weakness or issue, let's say regarding the QR process in a factory or line operation in a factory, etc. Number 10 is theory-based or operational construct sampling. So first of all, what is operational construct? Operational construct is a real-world example of the psychological construct that you are interested in actually running this. Now, this is a formal version of criterion sampling where instead of focusing on people as the unit of analysis, you're focusing on the event. So in here, the subject is the event. So you're trying to describe a particular event that is linked to the psychological construct that you're interested in. Okay, for example, if you are wanting to actually look at self-esteem, yeah, and then you want to see like what type of event would display like self-esteem, like maybe when politicians are having public talk, you know, or when they are doing public speaking, or you look at people who are doing public speaking competition, how their self-esteem actually affect them, how they actually display it on the stage, etc. When you have include more operational construct in your interest, then it becomes what they call multiple operationalism. It can get quite complex in this case. The key thing with theory-based and operational construct is that remember the subject itself are the events, not the person. The number 11 is confirming or disconfirming case. Now, this is run in two stages. Number one is exploratory. So this is where data collector tends to be quite general. So the researcher have to be flexible here. So it's like they don't actually know what exactly they are looking at. So it allows for a wider range of data to be collected in order to have an emerge pattern from the data. Okay, so again, this sounds really similar, isn't it? You actually wait for this and then the image data. Then you have the second phase, which is confirmatory stage. This is where you want to test the emergent pattern to see whether they are valid or not. And you actually recruit cases, and cases could be in two nature. It can be confirmatory or it can be disconfirming. So confirmatory means that the data from this participant will help you to confirm that the image pattern is correct, because when you analyze the data, similar pattern comes out. The disconfirmed cases would actually yield pattern different, yeah, from your initial one. That's why it's called disconfirming. Now, this is really similar to theoretical sampling, isn't it? Where there are two stages, you actually look for the initial one where it's remain flexible everything, then from the image pattern you decide what to do for the next stage. Yeah, the differences is that in confirming and disconfirming you still do purposeful sampling. There's something that's more closer to the topic that you are studying. Number two is that both confirmatory and disconfirmatory cases are essential here. Both of them will be able to help you to basically fine-tune the image pattern or the data that actually comes out. Theoretical sampling, on the other hand, might just simply change if you have a disconfirming cases. Yeah, so they're saying that, oh, should I include more people now because there are more emergent pattern, or should I just revise the pattern totally? Yeah, instead of just fine-tuning it. This is where it's a bit different now. Strategy number 12 is opportunistic sampling. This is where researchers are expected to make on the spot sampling decision. So it's like they have find something quite interesting, then their opportunity to ask more questions or actually recruit another group of participants. Let's say that you are running an experiment on studying experience of nurses again, caring for an elderly care in the hospital. Then you find that a lot of nurses actually talk about the role of doctor or even the janitor. Then it actually turns out that janitor might be able to actually provide you with interesting data. Then you actually go and recruit the janitor and ask question. That is opportunistic sampling. Okay, it doesn't have to be something that's built in your original design lah. It's just more a recommendation that qualitative researchers want to bear this in mind. Like if the opportunity emerge, why not? Okay, and you have your purposeful random sampling. This is where you still collect a random sample, but they are really small. Yeah, this is to test or resolve the issue of generalization. The idea is that random sampling would be the type of sampling method that have the highest external validity. Given that they are random, they should be applied to the larger population. But in contrast to a quantitative one, you still recruit a really small sample here rather than a large one. So number 14 is sampling politically important cases. This is a special case of critical case sampling, where again, remember, small amount but really important and things that will generate the highest quality of data lah. But this one, the unit of analysis or the subject is not person, again, is politically sensitive site. So the site that we're able to recruit or collect data from lah. Okay, so it's more can be additional sampling strategy to improve the usefulness and utilization of the data collected lah, where you are focusing on cases that are more politically important, things that are really sensitive to a politics scene. And then you have your convenience sampling. This is arguably the most popular qualitative sampling strategy. You just get whoever that you can get. So the people that is just around you, okay, you just grab them because it's convenient. Like most researcher would grab psychology students, etc., because they are teaching a class. It's easy to offer them credit and just recruit them, then they will go with it. But for both quantitative and qualitative research, this is the least desirable sampling approach, but yet again it is the most popular, if not one of the most popular. So tells you quite a lot, because using this method is neither purposeful nor strategic, because you are just grabbing people that are convenient, like you can grab one and you are not doing it because they are going to generate the richest data or is most relevant data. No, you are grabbing them because they are convenient. Okay, so it's not really recommended unless you have no choice. And number 16 basically is just mix different strategy, which is fine or and even encouraged in many cases. Like good example is Banner et al. 2016. Now originally they recruit participants who are victims of sexual adjustment. Then when they study and analyze the initial data, they found that it's actually linked to cancer trajectory. Like how likely is it someone who is going to develop cancer in the future? And that's why they start off with intensity sampling, when they will look for representative cases of sexual adjustment. Okay, then because they found out about the cancer trajectory thing, then they turn it into a maximum variation, where they try to get as much different sample as possible, because now they want to see what is affecting cancer trajectory. Then once they have the emergent pattern, they change into conforming versus disconforming case sampling, where they want to see whether the emergent patterns or emergent theory is actually correct or not, by studying whether new cases collected would confirm it. So those are the 16 strategies of purposeful sampling according to Patton 2002. So next is sample size. Okay, we already say like a qualitative research requires smaller sample size, but what is enough? And the idea is that it depends on two things. Okay, one is data saturation. Data saturation means that if you try to recruit new cases, it no longer offer you new things. Okay, so new cases reveal little further themes, insight, or perspective. So they just serve as a conforming case. If conforming cases keep on coming up, it means that your data is being saturated. So in this case, you no longer need to recruit new data. New participant. Your data is sufficient. You can actually analyze it and present a finding. So if you use purposeful sampling, it tends to increase the chances and speed to do this, given that you are looking at cases that will provide you with the richest data and relevant to your research question. Okay. The other one that actually determines the sample size is your data sufficiency. So this is making sure that the quality of the data is good enough and sufficient to permit comparison among selected dimension construct. Basically, the data you are collected is sufficient in order for you to generate valid findings. Okay, so that it will be cohesive and reflect or synthesis of other related work. Okay, so it's actually similar to previous studies, or actually tells you or inform you about previous studies. So they must be consistent. That is the sufficiency. You can see it's actually quite similar, sufficiency and saturation, but saturation requires further recruitment and shows that there is no longer chain use. Sufficiency is a bit hard to argue. It's more like for the data I've collected right now, the information that that emerge from my analysis seems to be consistent with past study. So from there, I conclude that my data is actually sufficient. It's a bit harder or a weaker argument. I will go for both if you really want to decide on the sampling size, but data saturation would be a much stronger argument here when you're making your decision. Okay. So what other factors other than the fact that you use purposeful sampling would affect your data saturation and data sufficiency? Firstly is the scope of the study. The wider the scope, the longer or more data is required lah. Okay, in order to reach saturation and sufficiency. And again, the more you try to cover, imagine the Bernard study just now. Originally is a victim of sexual adjustment, then actually change into cancer trajectory, and they try to get a really large scope data on it because they are using maximum variation. In that case, the data they need is actually quite large lah. And then you want to look at the nature of the topic. This means that whether the topic itself is actually wide or not. Okay, or do you actually need to recruit a lot of participants? So if you let's say talk about the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic in Malaysia, in that case you do need to record quite a lot of participants, given that there's no doubt that any city would affect the experience, where you live, even the different state, yeah, would actually affect the experience quite a lot. So in that case, you can imagine that there are a number of data that you need to get. And quality of data number 3 is linked to the purposive sampling methodology. Again, if you are able to get good informant that will actually provide you good quality data and really rich, then you might not actually need a lot of participants. You are able to get the data faster. Okay, and lastly, shadow data. Shadow data is an interesting thing. Shadow data means that you heard about your participant talking about another person experience on the same topic. So it's like, again, you ask the nurses regarding their experience of taking care of elderly patients during the pandemic time. They will tell you about the experience of their co-workers who actually do the same thing, but they are not their own lah. So that's the idea of shadow data. So it serves as a supplementary data lah. They allow you to have like extra informations. You know that it's actually from another person, but it actually gained through your participant. Okay, that is your shadow data. So these are the informations regarding the sampling in qualitative research. Hope you actually enjoy it. Right? I see you in Unit 3.